Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through history. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of quiet relaxation, I invite you to let your mind wander with me to a distant time and place. Before we begin our trip into the brutal life of everyday Europeans during the Middle Ages, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining me from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy these soft-spoken tales from the past, I encourage you to subscribe for more soothing, historical storytelling. Tonight, we'll be venturing back to the age of kings and queens, knights and peasants, great castles and humble villages. A time that captures the imagination, but one that was also filled with immense challenges and hardships for the average person. Yes, we're talking about medieval Europe, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries. But before we dive into the gritty realities of life in those times, let's ease in with a deep breath and allow ourselves to be transported back to a typical village in the European countryside, somewhere around the 12th century. Picture in your mind's eye a small cluster of simple houses, really more like huts, with walls made of mud and straw and roofs thatched with reeds. Smoke rises from the chimneys as the inhabitants begin to stir and start their day. Chickens peck at the ground and pigs root around in the muddy streets, their grunts and snuffles mingling with the bleating of sheep in the pastures beyond. The air is filled with the earthy scents of animals, wood smoke, and the slightly acrid tang of the tanner's work. In the distance, the Lord's manor house and the spire of the village church rise above the trees. It's a rustic scene, perhaps even charming to our modern sensibilities, but the quaintness belies the difficult realities faced by the people who called this place home. For the average peasant, life was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, back-breaking labour, and the oppressive weight of the feudal system that kept them tied to the land and beholden to their noble masters. As the sun rises and the rooster crows, we zoom in on one particular family. A weathered, careworn man, his wife with a baby at her breast, and their brood of children, as they rise from their straw mattresses to face another day of toil. Little do they know that today will bring challenges and heartbreak beyond the usual hardships they're accustomed to. The father, let's call him John, stretches his aching muscles as he steps out into the chill morning air. He's already dreading the long hours ahead, working the land that he rents from the local lord. He knows that his wife, Anne, will have her hands full with the little ones, grinding grain to make bread, tending the garden, feeding the animals. The children, too, will be put to work as soon as they're old enough to walk and carry a bucket. There's no time for play when every pair of hands is needed to ensure the family's survival. Even the eldest daughter at 12 years old knows she'll likely be married off soon to relieve the burden on her parents and to form an advantageous alliance with another family. As John and his older sons head out to the fields, let's pause for a moment to consider what their lives were really like, toiling under the hot sun and the watchful eye of the Lord's reeve. Subsistence farming was no easy task in an age before modern machinery and agricultural techniques. The tools they had were primitive, clumsy wooden ploughs, scythes to cut the wheat, flails to thresh the grain. The work was backbreaking, the days long, and the rewards meagre. A good harvest meant just enough to feed the family and pay the required portion to the Lord, with little left over to sell or trade. A bad harvest, though, could spell disaster, an inability to pay the rent and taxes, leading to hunger or even eviction from the land that was their only livelihood. And always, the spectre of illness and injury loomed. A broken bone, an infected cut, a bout of fever or flux. Any of these could be a death sentence in a time before antibiotics and modern medicine. John himself had lost 2 brothers in infancy and his father to a coughing sickness that left him wasted and struggling for breath. As the sun rises higher in the sky, John and his sons continue their labours, pausing only for a meagre midday meal of coarse bread and cheese. The blisters on their hands ooze and their backs ache, but they dare not rest for too long, lest they fall behind in their work and incur the wrath of the Lord or his reeve. The reeve himself was a peasant like them, but set a little apart by his role in overseeing the manor's lands and assigning duties to the serfs. Some reeves were fair-minded, doing their best to balance the needs of the peasants with the demands of the Lord. But many, drunk on the little power they wielded, became petty tyrants in their own right, doling out punishments and abuse with a liberal hand. As the long day wears on, let us turn our attention for a moment to one particular reeve, a hard-faced man by the name of Thomas. Thomas fancied himself a cut above the common rabble, with his slightly finer tunic and his self-important air. He took great pleasure in lauding his authority over the peasants under his command, meting out beatings for the slightest perceived infraction or disrespect. On this day, Thomas had his eye on John, who was struggling to keep up the pace in the fields. The harvest was poorer than expected this year, and John's youngest child had been sick with a fever, requiring more of Anne's time and attention. As a result, John had fallen behind in his assigned quota of bushels, and Thomas was determined to make an example of him. "You there, John!" Thomas bellowed, striding over to where John was working. "Why are you lagging? Do you think the Lord's granaries will fill themselves?" John kept his eyes down, knowing that any hint of defiance would only make matters worse. "Apologies, sir," he mumbled. "My child has been ill, and my wife." Thomas cut him off with a sneer. "Your wife, your child, your aching back. You serfs are full of excuses, but the Lord cares not for your troubles. He expects his due portion, and it's my job to see that he gets it." With that, Thomas gestured to one of his underlings, a burly man with a cudgel at his belt. 10 lashes, I think, to encourage better work ethic, and a double portion owed from his harvest to make up for his sloth. John felt his stomach drop as rough hands seized him and dragged him to the whipping post at the edge of the field. He knew that this punishment would leave him unable to work for days, and that the double portion would mean starvation for his family this winter. But he also knew that any resistance would only bring harsher retribution on himself and his loved ones. The witch trials of the medieval era were a particularly dark and tragic chapter in human history. Across Europe, thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of practicing witchcraft and subjected to brutal interrogations, torture, and executions. The sad tale of the lonely old woman ostracized by her village was all too common. She had lived on the outskirts of town for as long as anyone could remember. With no family to care for her, she relied on the charity of neighbors, trading herbal remedies and midwifery skills for meager scraps of food. But as she aged and grew more isolated, whispers began to spread. When crops failed or livestock fell ill, suspicious eyes turned toward the old woman and her strange concoctions. Children were warned not to stray near her dilapidated hovel, lest she lure them in with a curse. As fear and rumor took hold, it didn't take much for accusations of witchcraft to spread like wildfire. One day, a mob of angry villagers arrived at her door, led by the self-righteous parish priest. They dragged the terrified old woman before a hastily assembled tribunal, where she was accused of cavorting with the devil and casting wicked spells. No amount of pleading or professions of innocence could sway the bloodthirsty crowd. The trial, if one could call it that, was a farce. Dubious evidence and hearsay were presented as irrefutable proof of her guilt. When she refused to confess, even under duress, they had all the justification they needed. The sentence was passed: death by drowning. On a grey, drizzly morning, the old woman was bound hand and foot and carted to the river's edge. A priest offered a final chance at absolution if she would only admit her crimes, but she remained defiantly silent. With a nod from the bailiff, she was pushed into the frigid, swirling waters. As the life drained from her frail body, the villagers watched with a mix of satisfaction and horror. Some claimed to see dark spirits fleeing from her corpse, confirming their righteous judgment. Others simply turned away, eager to put the grim business behind them and return to their daily toils. In the end, the old woman's fate was sealed not by any genuine evil on her part, but by the fear, ignorance, and cruelty of a society all too ready to scapegoat its most vulnerable members. Her tragic story played out countless times in medieval Europe, as innocent lives were snuffed out in the name of religious fervor and mob justice. The lack of education and scientific understanding in the Middle Ages allowed such superstitions and paranoia to take deep root. For the average peasant laborer, there was little opportunity to learn beyond the most rudimentary of skills passed down by their elders. Reading and writing were privileges reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. In a world lit only by fire, where the forces of nature held sway over crops and health, it was all too easy to attribute misfortune to the work of evil spirits or malevolent neighbors. Without the tools to make sense of their hard-scrabble existence, people clung to folklore and the scant teachings of the church. Priests and monks, for their part, were often more concerned with preserving their own power and influence than spreading enlightenment to the masses. They jealously guarded their monopoly on knowledge, doling out bits of wisdom and dictating the course of village life as they saw fit. For a humble farmer or tradesman, challenging this entrenched order was unthinkable. The best one could hope for was to learn their prayers, pay their tithes, and stay in the good graces of the local authorities. Stepping out of line or drawing undue attention was a sure path to ruin. And so, for generations, the people of medieval Europe remained mired in a cycle of poverty, superstition, and oppression. The light of learning would eventually begin to pierce the gloom, with the rise of universities and the spread of the printing press in the later Middle Ages. But that brighter future must have seemed impossibly distant to the huddled masses toiling in the fields and muddy streets. Their days were an endless round of back-breaking labor, punctuated by the occasional wedding, religious festival, or public execution. Simple pleasures, a hearty meal, a warm fire, a kind word from a friend, took on outsized importance in a world with so little comfort or diversion. But even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endured. Mothers and fathers went on loving their children fiercely. Neighbors came together to face hardships, and even the lowliest serf dared to dream of a better life, if not in this world, then the next. These were the people who laid the foundations of modern Europe, brick by brick and seed by seed. Though they may be long forgotten as individuals, their struggles and sacrifices echo through the centuries. We who enjoy the fruits of their labors owe them a profound debt of gratitude. So let us return now to that humble peasant family we met at the beginning of our tale. As they lay down to sleep after another long, hard day, their bellies growling and their limbs heavy with fatigue, perhaps they take solace in the bonds of kinship and community that sustain them. The father pulls his cloak tight against the chill night air and whispers a prayer for a bountiful harvest. The mother gathers her little ones close, grateful to have survived another turn of the seasons. And the children drift off to sleep, their minds filled not with the cares of the day, but with the eternal childhood dreams of adventure and possibility. In the dying embers of the hearth fire, we see the faint promise of the world to come, a world of greater knowledge, prosperity, and freedom that their descendants will one day inhabit. A world that they themselves helped to build through their toil, their tears, and their quiet, unsung acts of love and resilience. And so we bid good night to our medieval forebears. secure in the knowledge that their legacy lives on in us. Rest well, weary travellers of ages past. Your story is our story, and it shall not be forgotten. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manor's fields, the weary peasant family trudges back to their humble dwelling. The father, his hands calloused and dirt-caked from a day of ploughing, leads the way. His wife follows close behind, a basket of meagre vegetables balanced on her hip. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, trail after them, their bare feet leaving imprints in the soft earth. The family's one-room hut offers little comfort after a long day of labour. The thatched roof leaks when it rains, and the walls are drafty in the winter. A single straw mattress, shared by the entire family, lies in the corner. The mother starts a small fire in the hearth and begins to prepare a bland stew of turnips, onions, and a scrap of salted pork. It's a meagre meal, but it will have to sustain them until the morning. As the children huddle around the flickering flames, the father regales them with stories passed down through generations. He tells of brave knights and fair maidens, of dragons and sorcerers. For a moment, the family forgets their hardships, transported to a world of magic and adventure. But reality soon seeps back in as a chill wind blows through the cracks in the walls. The family's plight is not unique. Across the land, thousands of peasant families endure similar hardships. They are the backbone of the feudal system, toiling day in and day out to support the lavish lifestyles of the nobility. But their lives are not their own. They are bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lord and the vagaries of nature. One such peasant was a man named John Atwood. Born in the early 14th century in a small village in England, John was the son of a farmer. From a young age, he learned the rhythms of the land, planting and harvesting crops with the changing of the seasons. He married young, as was the custom, and started a family of his own. But John's life took a turn for the worse when his village was struck by the Black Death. The plague arrived on the fleas of rats, spreading quickly through the close-knit community. John watched in horror as his neighbours fell ill, their bodies racked with fever and covered in oozing black boils. His own wife and 2 of his children succumbed to the disease, leaving him alone with his infant son. In the aftermath of the plague, John struggled to keep his farm afloat. With so many dead, there was a shortage of labour, and the lord of the manor demanded even more from the surviving peasants. John worked from sunup to sundown, his hands blistered and his back aching, but it was never enough. When he couldn't pay his rent, the lord's men seized his last cow, leaving him with no means to feed his son. Desperate and angry, John joined a group of peasants who were planning to revolt against their lord. They met in secret, whispering of freedom and justice. But their plan was discovered, and John was captured and brought before the lord for punishment. In the dank dungeon of the manor keep, John was subjected to unspeakable torture, his body broken and his spirit shattered. When he was finally released, John was a changed man. He returned to his farm, but he could no longer find joy in the simple pleasures of life. His son, now a young boy, tried to comfort him, but John was haunted by the memories of his ordeal. He became withdrawn and bitter, lashing out at those around him. As the years passed, John's health deteriorated. His hands, once strong and capable, were gnarled with arthritis. His eyesight dimmed and his hearing faded. He spent his days sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and muttering to himself. His son, now a grown man with a family of his own, did his best to care for him, but John was lost in his own world of pain and sorrow. One cold winter morning, John's son found him slumped over in his chair, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. He had passed away in the night, his suffering finally at an end. The village priest said a brief prayer over his body before it was lowered into the frozen ground. There was no headstone to mark his grave, just a simple wooden cross that would soon rot away. John Atwood's story is a testament to the hardships endured by the common people of medieval Europe. It is a story of poverty, disease, and oppression, of lives cut short by the cruelty of fate and the indifference of those in power. But it is also a story of resilience, of the human spirit's ability to endure even the darkest of times. As we look back on this period of history from the comfort of our modern lives, it is easy to romanticize the past, to imagine a world of chivalry and romance, of knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. But the reality was far different. For the vast majority of people, life was a constant struggle, a battle against hunger, disease, and the whims of those in power. Even the aristocracy, with their fine clothes and lavish banquets, were not immune to the hardships of the time. They too suffered from disease and malnutrition, from the constant threat of violence and political upheaval. And for all their wealth and power, they were still bound by the rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system, their lives dictated by the expectations of their rank and station. In the grand scheme of history, the medieval period may seem like a distant and alien world. But in many ways, the struggles and triumphs of the people who lived then are not so different from our own. They too loved and laughed, hoped and dreamed. They too sought meaning and purpose in their lives, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the stars wheel overhead and the world falls into slumber, let us take a moment to remember the lives of those who came before us. Let us honor their struggles and their sacrifices, and let us learn from their example. For in the end, we are all connected by the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity across the centuries and the miles. The peasant family sleeps now, huddled together for warmth on their straw mattress. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new sorrows, and new joys. But for now, they rest, their dreams a refuge from the hardships of their waking lives. And as the night deepens and the fire burns low, the ghosts of the past keep watch over them, whispering stories of hope and resilience in the darkness. As the Lord's procession winds its way back to the manor house, we turn our gaze to the serfs' quarters. Smoke rises from the thatched roofs, the scent of peat fires mixing with the earthy aroma of freshly baked bread. Children dart between the huts, their laughter a fleeting moment of joy amidst the daily grind. In one of these humble dwellings, we find a young boy named Thomas. He sits cross-legged on the dirt floor, watching intently as his father, John, carves a wooden spoon with a small knife. John's hands are rough and calloused, a testament to the years of toil in the fields. He looks up at his son with a weary smile. "One day, my boy," he says softly, "you'll have a trade of your own. A way to earn your keep that doesn't involve breaking your back in the fields." Thomas's eyes widen with curiosity. "Like what, father?" John sets down his knife and reaches for a piece of bread, breaking it in half and handing a portion to his son. "Well," he muses, "there's the blacksmith, the cooper, the tanner, men who make things with their hands. It's hard work, but it's a different kind of hard than what we do out there." He gestures towards the fields beyond their door. Thomas chews thoughtfully, his young mind trying to imagine a life beyond the manor. He's heard stories of the towns that are springing up across the land, places where a man might make his own way in the world. But for now, such dreams feel as distant as the stars. As the sun begins to set, John and Thomas make their way to the fields for the final work of the day. They join the other serfs in the communal strip of land, each family responsible for their own plot. The soil is heavy and thick, clinging to their boots as they walk the furrows. John takes up his ox-driven plough, the beast snorting and stamping as it feels the weight of the yoke. Thomas follows behind, scattering seeds from a woven basket hanging at his side. It's back-breaking work, the plough catching on roots and rocks, the seeds disappearing into the unyielding earth. As they work, John regales his son with tales of their ancestors, men and women who worked this same land for generations. He speaks of their triumphs and their failures, the harsh winters and the bountiful harvests. Thomas listens intently, feeling the weight of history on his young shoulders. But there's one story that John has never told, one that haunts his dreams and gnaws at his waking hours. It's the story of his own father, a man broken by the cruelty of their Lord. Thomas's grandfather was a strong man, a skilled farmer who could coax life from even the most stubborn soil. But he was also a proud man, one who chafed at the injustices of the feudal system. When the Lord demanded an extra portion of the harvest one year, leaving the serfs with barely enough to survive, Thomas's grandfather refused. The punishment was swift and brutal. The Lord's men dragged the old man before the entire village, his hands bound behind his back. The Lord himself delivered the sentence, 30 lashes for disobedience. Thomas's grandfather was stripped to the waist, his weathered skin bared to the cold autumn air. The whip cracked through the air, again and again, each strike painting a vivid red line across the old man's back. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the manor walls. When it was over, they left him there, bound and bleeding, as a warning to the others. John, just a boy at the time, watched helplessly as his father struggled to stand, his once proud back bent with pain and humiliation. That night, as John helped his mother tend to his father's wounds, he made a silent vow. He would never let the same thing happen to his own family. He would bear the injustices, the backbreaking labor, the gnawing hunger, all to keep them safe. Now, as he watches Thomas scattering seeds with the careless enthusiasm of youth, John feels that vow weighing heavy on his heart. He knows that his son deserves a better life, a chance to be more than just another serf tied to the land. But how can he give him that chance when every day is a struggle just to survive? As the sun dips below the horizon, John and Thomas make their way back to the village, their bodies aching with fatigue. The smoke from the fires has died down, replaced by the flicker of tallow candles in the windows. In their own hut, John's wife, Margaret, has laid out a meagre supper of stewed turnips and barley bread. She looks up as they enter, her face lined with worry. "Any news from the manor?" she asks softly, her eyes searching John's face for some sign of hope. John shakes his head as he sinks onto the rough-hewn bench. "Just the usual demands," he sighs. "More grain for the Lord's table, more hours in the fields." Margaret nods, her own shoulders sagging with the weight of their shared burden. She ladles out the thin stew into wooden bowls, her hands shaking slightly. As they eat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, a sudden commotion outside breaks the stillness. John leaps to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. But it's not the Lord's men come to mete out some new punishment. It's a group of villagers, their faces ashen in the flickering candlelight. They crowd around the doorway, their voices rising in a jumble of fear and confusion. John pushes his way through the throng, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, lying in the center of the village square, is a sight that will haunt him for the rest of his days. It's the body of a young man, his skin mottled with dark, oozing lumps. His eyes stare sightlessly at the night sky, his mouth frozen in a rictus of pain. The villagers recoil in horror, their hands flying to their faces to ward off the stench of death. John feels a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. He's heard the rumors, whispers of a terrible plague sweeping across the land. A pestilence that strikes without warning, leaving entire villages devastated in its wake. As he stares at the lifeless body of the young man, John knows that their lives are about to change forever. The Black Death has come to their village, and nothing will ever be the same again. In the days that follow, the plague spreads like wildfire through the cramped, filthy streets of the village. Families huddle together in their huts, watching helplessly as loved ones succumb to the fever and the chills, the agonizing pain of the swollen, blackened lumps. John and Margaret do their best to keep Thomas safe, keeping him close and praying fervently to a God who seems to have abandoned them. But even their best efforts can't stop the inexorable march of the pestilence. It starts with a cough, a slight fever that they try to ignore. But soon, Margaret is bedridden, her body racked with pain as the lumps begin to appear on her skin. John tends to her day and night, bathing her fevered brow and whispering words of comfort that ring hollow in his own ears. When she finally slips away, her once bright eyes dulled by the ravages of the disease, John feels a part of himself die with her. He buries her in the small churchyard, the ground already crowded with the freshly dug graves of their neighbours. Thomas, his face streaked with tears, clings to his father's leg as the priest intones the last rites. John holds him close, trying to be strong for his son, even as his own heart is breaking. In the weeks that follow, the village descends into a kind of madness. The fields go untended, the livestock wandering freely as their owners succumb to the plague. The Lord and his family barricade themselves in the manor house, leaving the serfs to fend for themselves. John and Thomas eke out a meagre existence, foraging for what food they can find and praying that they will be spared. But the spectre of death hangs heavy over the village, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this harsh, unforgiving world. As the days stretch into weeks and the weeks into months, the plague begins to loosen its grip on the village. The sick and dying are replaced by the hollow-eyed survivors, their bodies wasted by hunger and grief. John and Thomas emerge from their hut, blinking in the bright sunlight like creatures from another world. The village is a ghost of its former self, the once bustling streets now eerily silent. But even in the midst of this desolation, there are glimmers of hope. The fields, untended for so long, are beginning to sprout with new growth. The sound of a baby's cry echoes through the empty streets, a sign that life, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, goes on. John takes Thomas by the hand and leads him out into the fields. They stand together, surveying the land that has been their livelihood and their burden for so long. "We will rebuild," John says softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We will honor those we have lost by living the best lives we can." Thomas nods, his young face etched with a gravity beyond his years. He knows that the road ahead will be hard, that the scars of the plague will linger long after the last victim has been laid to rest. But he also knows that he has his father by his side, a man who has endured the unimaginable and come out the other side. Together, they will face whatever challenges lie ahead, united by the bonds of family and the resilience of the human spirit. As they turn back towards the village, ready to begin the long, slow process of rebuilding, the sun breaks through the clouds, bathing the land in a warm, golden light. It's a small thing, a fleeting moment of beauty in a world that has known so much darkness. But for John and Thomas, it's a sign of hope, a promise that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. The years pass, and slowly, painfully, the village begins to heal. New families move into the abandoned huts, the sound of children's laughter once again filling the streets. The fields are planted and harvested, the rhythm of the seasons reasserting itself in the face of unimaginable loss. John and Thomas work side by side, their bond stronger than ever. Thomas grows into a strong, capable young man, his hands calloused from years of toil in the fields. But he never forgets the lessons he learned in those dark days of the plague, the value of family and community in the face of adversity. As he watches his own children playing in the village square, Thomas sometimes thinks back to that distant conversation with his father, the one about finding a trade of his own. He knows now that there is no escape from the land, no easy path to a better life. But he also knows that there is honor in the work they do, in the sweat and the struggle of coaxing life from the stubborn earth. He takes pride in the calluses on his hands, the ache in his back at the end of a long day. And when the Lord comes calling, demanding his portion of the harvest, Thomas meets his gaze with a steady eye. He knows the injustices of the system, the cruelty that can be inflicted on those who dare to resist. But he also knows the strength of his own spirit, the unbreakable bonds of family and community that have seen them through the darkest of times. He will bear the burden as his father did before him, so that his own children may one day know a better life. As the sun sets over the manor house, Thomas makes his way back to his own humble dwelling. Inside, his wife has laid out a simple supper, the fruits of their own labours. They eat in companionable silence, the love between them a warm, steady glow in the flickering candlelight. Later, as they lie in the darkness, Thomas pulls his wife close, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing against his chest. He knows that the life they live is a hard one, filled with uncertainty and sorrow, but he also knows that it is a life worth living, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. And as he drifts off to sleep, he dreams of a better world, a world where his children's children may one day know true freedom and prosperity. It's a distant dream, as distant as the stars that wheel overhead in the vast, endless sky. But it's a dream worth holding on to, a glimmer of hope in a world that can sometimes feel so hopelessly dark. And so, the cycle continues, the seasons turning in their endless dance. The serfs toil and struggle, bearing the weight of an unjust system with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. They find joy in the small things, in the love of family and the beauty of a sunset over the fields. And through it all, they endure, their spirits unbroken by the hardships they face. They are the backbone of this land, the beating heart that keeps it alive through the darkest of times. As we take our leave of this humble village, we carry with us the stories of those who came before, the joys and sorrows that shaped their lives. We are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bonds of love and community that can see us through even the darkest of nights. And though the world may change, though empires may rise and fall, these simple truths remain constant, a guiding light in an uncertain world. So let us hold fast to them, these humble serfs and their quiet, unbreakable strength. For in the end, it is they who will endure, long after the lords and ladies have faded into dust. It is they who will carry the torch of hope into a brighter tomorrow, their spirits forever unbroken, forever free. As we close our eyes and drift off into the realm of dreams, we carry with us the echoes of their stories, the whispers of their lives. We are reminded of the beauty and the sorrow, the joy and the pain that make up the tapestry of human existence, and in that moment, we are one with them, these humble serfs of a distant age. Their struggles are our struggles, their triumphs our triumphs. We are bound together by the common threads of love and loss, hope and fear. So let us rest now, secure in the knowledge that we are part of something greater, a story that stretches back through the ages and will continue long after we are gone. Let us take comfort in the quiet strength of those who came before and in the promise of a better world to come. And as we sleep, let us dream of that world, a world where the chains of oppression are finally broken, where every man, woman, and child may know the joy of true freedom. It is a dream worth holding on to, a dream that will guide us through the darkest of nights and into the light of a new dawn. So rest now, weary traveller, and let the stories of the past be your lullaby. For in the end, It is the stories that endure, the tales of love and loss, hope and heartbreak that echo through the ages. And as long as those stories are told, as long as they are cherished and held close to our hearts, the spirit of those long ago serfs will never truly die. They will live on in us, in the quiet strength that carries us through the darkest of times. So sleep now and dream of a better world. A world where the stories of the past are not forgotten, but woven into the fabric of our own lives. A tapestry of hope and resilience that will endure for generations to come. Let's return now to the young blacksmith's apprentice we met earlier, toiling away long hours in the sweltering forge. His hands are covered in blisters and calluses, his face streaked with soot and sweat. The work is grueling and repetitive, hammering out horseshoes, nails, tools, and weapons for the manor and village. But he knows this is his one shot at a better life, a chance to rise above the drudgery of serfdom. The blacksmith is a tough master, quick to cuff the boy's ears for any mistake or slowness. But he also teaches the secrets of the trade, how to heat the metal just so, to fold it again and again until it becomes strong and supple. The boy watches in awe as the blacksmith crafts a gleaming sword for the Lord, the steel rippling like water in the orange glow of the coals. He dreams that someday his own work will be so fine, so sought after. But the road ahead is long and uncertain. As an apprentice, the boy is little more than an indentured servant, bound to his master for years, with only a small stipend for food and lodging. He sleeps on a straw pallet in the back of the forge, rising before dawn to stoke the flames and begin the day's work. His hands never seem to come fully clean of the black soot ground into the cracks and creases. Even if he does complete his apprenticeship and become a journeyman, the future is fraught with challenges. The guilds strictly control who can practice each trade and open a shop of their own. They set prices, standards for quality, and limits on competition. To advance, the boy will have to navigate this complex web of restrictions and politics. He'll need to pay hefty fees, create a masterpiece to prove his skill, and curry favor with the guild leaders. Many aspiring craftsmen become stuck at this stage, unable to afford the costs of starting a business. If the young man does manage to become a master blacksmith with his own forge, he'll face the daily struggles of running a medieval business, securing raw materials like iron ore and charcoal, which are controlled by the wealthy merchants, drumming up customers and commissions in a crowded marketplace, haggling over prices and payments, repairing and replacing tools, hiring and managing apprentices of his own, all while trying to eke out a modest living for himself and his family. And looming over it all is the spectre of disease, injury, and debt. A serious illness could leave him unable to work, with no savings to tide him over. An accident from a hot forge or sharp metal could maim or even kill. A noble customer who refuses to pay for services could drive him to ruin. With no social safety net, one stroke of bad luck could cast him right back down into the depths of poverty. As the apprentice lies on his lumpy straw mattress at the end of another exhausting day, massaging his aching muscles, he wonders if it's all worth it. To be a serf is a hard, miserable life of back-breaking labor and constant toil with no hope of advancement. But to be a craftsman is to walk a razor's edge between modest success and destitution. Both paths seem strewn with obstacles and suffering. And yet, as his eyes drift closed, succumbing to sleep, the young man can't help but dream of a brighter future. A shop of his own, a hearty fire in the forge, a row of gleaming blades and sturdy tools awaiting happy customers. A pretty wife, healthy children, a cozy cottage with glass in the windows and meat on the table. A little dignity and respect from his fellow man. A life where his sweat and skill actually earn him something more than a crust of bread and a kick from his master. It may be distant, it may be improbable, but it's still a far sweeter dream than any serf sleeping in the muddy fields could claim. The next day, as the apprentice plunges the red-hot metal into the water with a hiss and a cloud of steam, he will hold that dream in his mind. He'll let it carry him through the aching arms, the burnt fingers, the scolding from the blacksmith. Like the sword he is learning to forge, hammered, folded, hammered again. He will let each hardship mold him, shape him, make him stronger and sharper. Perhaps strong enough to cut through the chains of his birth, to forge a new path. Only time, toil, and tenacity will tell. As the Black Death rampages through Europe in the mid-14th century, no corner of society is safe from its ravages. But it is the poor and powerless who suffer the worst. The serfs crammed into fetid hovels, the craftsmen laboring in crowded workshops, the beggars and street urchins lurking in the alleyways. They are the first to fall ill, their malnourished bodies offering little resistance to the disease. And they are the last to receive care, medicine, or relief in a world where such things are reserved for the wealthy. Our blacksmith's apprentice watches in horror as the plague creeps ever closer to his village. First, travelers bring rumors of a strange sickness in distant parts, of towns barricading their gates, of mass graves overflowing with bodies. Then those who fled the hot zones begin arriving, desperate for food and shelter, some already showing signs of fever and boils. The manor lord orders them turned away, but it's too late. The pestilence slips in silently, a flea riding on a rat, a cough carrying on the wind. Soon, the first villagers fall ill, a shepherd boy, a washerwoman, a friar. Their families try to hide them, fearing the stigma and isolation. But there is no keeping the sickness secret, as it spreads like wildfire through the close-packed huts and streets. The symptoms are unmistakable and terrifying, painful, egg-sized swellings in the armpits and groin, oozing pus and blood. Dark blotches under the skin, signaling internal bleeding, raging fever and vomiting, delirium and anguish. The blacksmith sickens quickly, his huge, powerful body ravaged by the infection. The apprentice does his best to care for him, bringing water to slake his thirst, masking the stench of sickness with herbs, praying desperately to every saint he knows. But it's no use. Within days, the strong and vital man is reduced to a shivering, raving wreck, his skin blackened with hemorrhages. He dies in agony, choking on his own bloody bile. The boy can scarcely register the loss of his master before others in the household fall ill. The blacksmith's wife, his young children, the other apprentices. One by one they wither and perish, like flowers shriveling under a merciless sun. The forge goes cold and silent, the tools gathering dust, the unfinished projects abandoned on the workbench. There are no customers anyway. The village has become a ghost town, the healthy barricaded in their homes, the sick wailing in the streets. In desperation, the village priest sends for a plague doctor from the city. He arrives in the distinctive beaked mask and long, dark robes, a sinister, bird-like figure, more omen than savior. The mask is stuffed with straw, herbs and spices, thought to purify the noxious humours of disease. But to the apprentice, it seems as though death himself has come, a grim reaper making his rounds. The doctor sets to work, his methods based more on superstition than science. He lights bonfires to clear the putrid air. He prescribes potions of mercury, arsenic, and ground unicorn horn. He cuts open the buboes to release the deadly vapors, then cauterizes them with a red-hot poker. His patients scream in agony, the cure almost as terrible as the sickness itself. More often than not, he merely eases their passing with opium and prayer. The apprentice sees no sign of the disease loosening its grip. The death toll mounts day by day, the bodies piling up faster than they can be buried. Carts rumble through the streets, the drivers calling, "Bring out your dead!" Bereaved families tip their loved ones into mass graves. No time for proper funerals or mourning. Some choose to wall up the sick in their homes, leaving them to die alone rather than risk infection. Others abandon them on the roadside, or worse, blame them for bringing the sickness and attack them as witches. As the death toll mounts, society itself begins to break down. With so many taken ill or fleeing, there are not enough well folks to tend the fields, keep the forges lit, weave the cloth, guard the towns. Crops wither on the vine, livestock roam unattended. The manor lord withdraws to his keep, posting archers to shoot any sick peasants who approach seeking aid. Roaming gangs of bandits prey on travellers and unprotected villages. Some turn to wild revelry, drinking and feasting, reasoning they may die tomorrow. Others fall into despair and madness, donning sackcloth, whipping themselves in penance, becoming flagellants wandering the land. Through it all, the apprentice somehow survives, tending his stricken household, his tools sitting idle. But as the Black Death burns itself out over months, leaving half the village dead, he wonders what is left to live for. His master, his friends, his purpose, all taken by the merciless pestilence. He is alone and adrift, the future he once dreamed of turned to ashes and dust. And yet, as a numb torpor settles over him, a strange thought kindles in the depths of his grief. He is alive. Against all odds, he endures. The sickness did not take him. His strong young body, tempered by long hours at the forge, has proven its mettle. And as the shock wears off, a flicker of something like determination stirs in his breast. He is the last one standing. It falls to him now to rebuild, to pick up the pieces. Slowly, with shaking hands, the apprentice pulls his apron over his head and picks up his hammer. The metal is cool in his hands, the weight familiar and grounding. He pumps the bellows and watches the coals spring to life, a tiny sun glowing in the darkness. He has no master now. He must become his own master. No customers, no coin. He must create something from nothing. No roadmap, no plan. He must chart his own course. But as he draws the glowing iron from the forge and sets it on the anvil, he feels a glimmer of something that might be hope. The world has crumbled to dust around him. But from dust and ashes, the smithy knows, new things can be forged. Just as the plague scoured the land, purging the old order, perhaps it has also cleared the way for something new. A blank slate, a chance to rebuild from the rubble. With each strike of his hammer, the apprentice pours his grief, his rage, his defiant will to live into the metal. He doesn't know what shape it will take, a tool, a weapon, a talisman, but he knows it will carry a piece of his resilient spirit within it, hard and shining, an emblem of the human ability to persist, to create meaning and beauty even in the deepest darkness. The plume of the plague has passed, leaving a shattered world in its wake. But in a humble forge, a spark endures, kindling an ember of determination. The apprentice knows not what the future holds, but he knows he will meet it as the blacksmith meets the iron, with sweat, skill, and indomitable will, forging ahead into the unknown. The 100 Years' War raged across medieval Europe like a wildfire, consuming lives, resources, and hope with equal fervor. What began as a squabble over succession to the French throne metastasized into a generations-long struggle as the kings of England and France vied for supremacy. But as usual, it was the common folk who paid the steepest price, uprooted from their lands, conscripted into battle, caught between the grinding gears of rival noble ambitions. Our young blacksmith, still reeling from the devastation of the Black Death, finds himself swept up in this maelstrom of violence. With the ranks of fighting men thinned by disease, the local lord presses every able-bodied man into service to fill out his army. The smith, with his strong arms and familiarity with weapons, is a prime target. He is torn from his forge and handed a dented second-hand sword, a cheap metal helmet, a hauberk of rusting mail, scant protection against the arrows, blades and bludgeons of war. The apprentice-turned-soldier marches off to fight a battle he barely understands, for a cause that means nothing to him. He leaves behind his village, his forge, the fading hopes of the life he dreamed of building. He is a pawn on the Lord's chessboard now, a cog in the feudal machinery of warfare. His wishes, his well-being, scarcely enter their calculation. So many are the warm bodies to be thrown into the fray. He huddles around meagre campfires with the other conscripts, a motley crew of farmers, labourers, tradesmen, and beggars. They are all equally grimy, hungry, and afraid, united only by their lowly station and the whims of their betters. They trade rumours of the English army's numbers, their fearsome longbowmen, the newfangled cannons that spit iron and fire. Some boast of the glory and plunder to be won, but most simply pray to survive, to see home and hearth again. The reality of battle shatters even those modest hopes. The young smith finds himself in a muddy field in Crecy, a tiny village that will loom large in history. It is an unbearably hot day. The mail shirts searing the men's skin, the horses lathered with sweat. The English have taken the high ground, but the French knights, prideful and impetuous, insist on charging. The first rank thunders forward, a wall of steel and horseflesh, and is scythed down like wheat by a hail of arrows from the English longbows. The knights crash into their own footmen, trampling them in their haste to retreat. The second wave meets the same fate, the fallen mounts and men becoming obstacles for the next. It is a disaster. The fabled flower of French chivalry wilting in an afternoon. For the blacksmith and his fellows, it is a vision of hell, horses screaming and thrashing in the mud, riddled with arrows, shining armor gaping open to reveal the bloody ruin beneath, limbs and heads scattered like threshing chaff, the ground churned into a slurry of entrails and earth, the awful, unrelenting hiss and hum of the arrows like monstrous insects, the smells of blood, loosed bowels, smoke and metal on a broiling hot day, the hideous sound of iron and bone meeting and parting again and again. The apprentice fights not for king and country, but for his own survival. All thoughts of glory or bravery desert him, leaving only the basest animal instinct to live. He swings his sword wildly, clumsily, desperately trying to keep the English men-at-arms from gutting him. His arms ache, his breath comes in ragged gasps, his eyes sting with sweat and smoke. He slips in the mud, goes down under a stampede of retreating footmen, fearing he'll be crushed. By the time he regains his feet, the day is definitively lost, the French in full rout. His only solace is that he is fleeing too, bloodied, battered, but somehow still breathing. But as the young smith stumbles away from that charnel field, he wonders if survival is truly a mercy. He sees things he will never unsee, things that will revisit him in nightmares, waking and sleeping, for years to come. The twisted faces of the dead, the inhuman sounds of the dying, the terrible, casual cruelty of war, snuffing out lives like candles. He has forged fine steel blades, but never before felt their true purpose: to rend, to pierce, to slaughter. In the crucible of combat, he has seen the abyss of human brutality, and it has forever changed him. The journey back to his village is long and bitter. Of his original band of conscripts, scarcely 1 in 3 remains. They limp home like scarecrows, hollow-eyed and gaunt, some nursing grievous wounds sure to putrefy. They have no victory to report, no glory to their names, only the horror of what they have witnessed and done. The lords in their high castles may toast and strategize, move their pieces for the next encounter. But for the pawns on the ground, the foot soldiers, the archers, the blacksmith-made warrior. War leaves only scars and echoes, haunting their sleep and dogging their days. The young smith finds his forge cold, his tools rusted, the hopeful future he once imagined now seeming like a cruel jape. His fields have gone to seed while he was fighting for his lord's cause, his meagre savings exhausted. He will have to rebuild again, from less than nothing. This time with hands that tremble when they grip the hammer, ears that ring with the phantom twang of bowstrings, a heart cauterized by suffering he never sought. He takes up his tools, for he has no other choice, but he is a different man now, older and harder than his years, forged in the fires of pestilence and war. The 100 Years' War will grind on, an insatiable maw consuming lives and hopes. Kings and kingdoms will. The manor system was the backbone of feudal society in medieval Europe. At the center of each manor was the Lord's Keep, a fortified stone building that served as both a residence and a symbol of power. Surrounding the keep were the more humble dwellings of the serfs, small one-room huts made of mud and thatch. They were clustered together in a village, with a communal well and perhaps a modest church. The serfs were bound to the land, tied by a complex web of obligations and duties to their lord. In exchange for a small plot of land to farm for themselves, they were required to work the lord's fields, paying rent in the form of crops and labor. They had little freedom or autonomy. The lord dictated where they could live, who they could marry, and even what crops they could grow. It was a rigid social hierarchy, with each person's role and status determined by birth. At the top were the nobility, with their vast land holdings, fine clothes, and grand feasts. Below them were the clergy, who held significant power and influence through the church. And at the bottom were the serfs, the poorest and most oppressed class, who toiled in the fields from sunrise to sunset. The lord and lady of this particular manor were a vain and petty pair. They were obsessed with maintaining their status and prestige, always trying to outdo the neighboring noble families in displays of wealth and power. The lord, Sir Reginald, was a cruel and calloused man, quick to anger and slow to forgive. He would think nothing of punishing a serf for the slightest infraction, a stray pig in his gardens, a perceived slight to his authority. The punishments were harsh and humiliating, often involving public floggings or time in the stocks. Lady Eloise, his wife, was no less heartless. She spent her days in idle gossip and needlepoint, complaining endlessly about the quality of the food or the laziness of the servants. She demanded the finest silks and furs, caring little for the expense or the toll it took on the serfs whose labour paid for her luxuries. Together, Lord Reginald and Lady Eloise ruled their little fiefdom with an iron fist, squeezing every last drop of labour and loyalty from their beleaguered subjects. Life on the manor was an endless cycle of work, punctuated only by the occasional feast day or wedding. The serfs were essentially property, with few rights and little recourse against the whims and cruelties of their lord and lady. They were born into this life of servitude, and most would die never knowing anything else. One such serf was a young man named John. John had grown up on the manor, watching his father and grandfather bow and scrape before the Lord, breaking their backs in the fields to eke out a meagre existence. As a boy, John had dreamed of a different life, of being a warrior or a merchant, of seeing the world beyond the narrow confines of the village. But as he grew older, he came to realize the futility of such dreams. He was a serf, tied to the land by birth and by debt, with no hope of escape. John's life took a turn for the worse when Lord Reginald decided to host a lavish feast for the neighbouring nobles. He wanted to impress them with his wealth and generosity, to show that he was a force to be reckoned with. But such a feast was expensive, and Lord Reginald was not a man to dip into his own coffers. Instead, he increased the rents and taxes on his serfs, demanding more of their crops and more of their labor. John's family was already struggling to get by, and the increased burden was more than they could bear. They had to choose between paying their rent and having enough to eat. John's father fell ill from the stress and overwork, and without access to proper medicine, he quickly succumbed. John was left as the head of the household, responsible for his mother and younger siblings. Desperate and angry, John made a reckless decision. In the dead of night, he snuck into Lord Reginald's storehouse and stole a sack of grain. It was a small act of defiance, a way to feed his family for a little while longer. But it was also a grave crime, and when the theft was discovered, Lord Reginald was furious. John was dragged before the Lord and made to confess his crime. In front of the whole village, he was stripped to the waist and tied to a post. Lord Reginald himself wielded the whip, laying into John's back with a fury born of wounded pride. The punishment was brutal, far exceeding the severity of the crime. By the end, John's back was a raw, bleeding mess, and he could barely stand. He was thrown into a dank cell to recover, with only mouldy straw for a bed and stale bread and water to sustain him. As he lay there, half delirious with pain and fever, John cursed the unfairness of it all. He had only stolen to feed his starving family, and for that, he had been beaten nearly to death. Meanwhile, Lord Reginald dined on roast pheasant and fine wine, never sparing a thought for the serfs who made his lavish lifestyle possible. It was a brutal, unjust system, and John felt the full weight of its oppression bearing down on him. But what could he do? He was just one man, a lowly serf with no power or influence. He knew that any further acts of rebellion would only bring more pain and suffering down on himself and his loved ones. And so, with a heavy heart, John resigned himself to his fate. He would continue to toil in the fields, to bow and scrape before his lord and lady, to endure the hardships and humiliations of life as a serf. As he drifted off into an uneasy sleep, John's last thoughts were of his father, who had worked himself into an early grave, and of his own children, who would likely face the same bleak future. It was a cycle of poverty and oppression that seemed unbreakable, a yoke that would burden generations to come. In that moment, the grandeur and chivalry of the feudal system seemed like a cruel joke, a thin veneer over a rotten, stagnant core. And John wept for himself and for all the other nameless, faceless serfs who suffered under its weight. But even in the depths of his despair, John clung to a faint hope. He had heard whispers of change on the wind, of peasant revolts in far-off lands, of the rise of a new class of artisans and merchants in the towns. Perhaps in time, the old order would crumble and a new, more just society would take its place. It was a fragile dream, but it was all he had to cling to in the dark. As the years passed, John's scars healed, but the memory of his brutal punishment never faded. It served as a constant reminder of his place in the world, of the yawning chasm between the high and the low. He married and had children of his own, watching with a heavy heart as they took their place in the fields beside him. There were small moments of joy, of course, the birth of a healthy child, a particularly bountiful harvest, the rare feast day when the work stopped and the ale flowed freely. But these were fleeting respites in a life of unrelenting toil and hardship. The spectre of hunger, disease, and the Lord's wrath always loomed, ready to snatch away what little comfort they had managed to scrape together. As John grew older, he began to feel the toll of a lifetime of labor in his bones. His hands were gnarled and calloused, his back stooped from years of bending over the plough. He watched as his own children grew up and took their place in the cycle of poverty and servitude, and he felt a deep, aching sadness. But he also felt a flicker of something else, a small, stubborn flame of resilience and hope. For all the hardships and injustices they faced, the serfs of the manor were a community, bound together by shared suffering and small acts of kindness. They looked out for each other, sharing what little they had in times of need, celebrating together when they could. And in that solidarity, John found a kind of strength. It was not the strength of kings and knights, but the quiet, enduring strength of the common man. It was the strength to get up each morning and face another day of back-breaking labor, to find moments of laughter and love amidst the struggle, to dream of a better life even when all seemed hopeless. As he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, John reflected on his life. It had been a hard one, full of pain and injustice, but it had also been a life lived with integrity, with a stubborn refusal to let the cruelties of the world break his spirit. In the end, that was perhaps his greatest legacy. Not wealth or status, but the simple, unyielding dignity of a life well lived in the face of adversity. And as he took his last breaths, John let himself imagine a future where his descendants might know a different kind of life, one free from the shackles of servitude, where a person's worth was not determined by the circumstances of their birth. It was a distant dream, but one worth holding on to, even in the darkest of times. With that final, quiet hope, John slipped away, leaving behind a world that would continue to turn, season after season, through the endless cycle of sowing and reaping, of birth and death and rebirth. The manor and its inhabitants would endure, as they always had, finding small moments of grace and beauty amidst the struggle, waiting for the day when the old order might finally give way to the new. The life of a peasant farmer in medieval Europe was one of endless toil and hardship. From sunup to sundown, they labored in the fields, their hands calloused and blistered from gripping primitive tools. The plough, a simple wooden contraption, was pulled by an ox or horse if the farmer was lucky enough to have one. More often, the farmer and his family would drag the plough through the stubborn earth themselves, their muscles straining with each step. The crops they grew were meager and basic: wheat, barley, rye, and maybe some vegetables if there was spare land. The yield was never certain, always at the mercy of the weather and pests. A failed harvest meant going hungry and being unable to pay the rent and taxes owed to the lord of the manor. It was a precarious existence, always one bad season away from ruin. Even in good years, the life of a peasant was one of subsistence. Most of what they grew went to the lord as payment for living and working on his land. They were left with just enough to feed themselves, and even then, the food was plain and monotonous. Bread made from coarse grains, pottages of vegetables and beans, and the occasional scrap of meat or cheese if they were fortunate. The work was relentless and backbreaking, ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, with only crude hand tools to aid them. There were no days off, no respite from the constant labor. Even children as young as 5 or 6 would be put to work, scaring away birds or gleaning the fields for fallen grain. Elderly family members who could no longer handle the physical toil would spin wool or do other handicrafts to contribute. The living conditions were squalid and cramped. The peasant family would dwell in a small one-room hut, the walls made of wattle and daub, the roof thatched with straw. The floor was dirt, covered with rushes or straw that would grow fetid and infested over time. There was no privacy, no escape from the smells and noise of the livestock that often shared their living space. Disease was a constant spectre, aided by the lack of hygiene and sanitation. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses spread easily in the close quarters and contaminated water. Injuries from farm work were common, and there was little effective medical treatment beyond herbal remedies and prayer. A simple cut could become infected and fatal. A broken bone could leave a person crippled for life. In the face of all these hardships, the peasants clung to their faith and their families for solace. The church offered the promise of a better life after death, a reward for their suffering and toil in this world. Marriages and births were causes for celebration, brief respites from the daily drudgery. But even these joys were tempered by the harsh realities of the time. Many children didn't survive to adulthood, succumbing to disease or malnutrition. Women often died in childbirth, leaving their husbands to remarry quickly out of necessity. The elderly, too frail to work, were seen as burdens, another mouth to feed in a world of scarcity. Despite it all, the peasants endured, year after back-breaking year. They found small moments of happiness where they could: a successful harvest, a juicy bit of gossip, a lively tune played on a homemade instrument. They told stories and sang songs to pass the time and lighten their loads, even if just for a little while. But always, the spectre of the Lord loomed over them, his manor house on the hill a constant reminder of their place in the rigid social order. They were bound to him and to the land, with a little hope of ever changing their station. The Lord controlled every aspect of their lives, from the crops they grew to the marriages they made. The peasants were serfs, essentially owned by the Lord, and unable to leave the manor without his permission. It was a form of slavery, a bondage that passed from father to son, mother to daughter. The Lord could punish them for any perceived infraction, from failing to pay their taxes to poaching game in his forest. The penalties were harsh, ranging from fines to floggings to time in the stocks. But as bad as life under their Lord could be, the peasants feared the chaos of the outside world even more. There were stories of marauding bandits, of whole villages wiped out by disease or famine. At least on the manor, there was a measure of stability and security, even if it came at the cost of their freedom. And so they endured, these hardy men and women, eking out an existence on the margins of society. They bore witness to the wars and intrigues of the nobles, but were rarely touched by them directly. Their concerns were more immediate: the weather, the harvest, the health of their livestock. But even the lowliest peasant could dream of a better life, even if they knew it was likely out of reach. Perhaps their children or grandchildren would be the ones to break free of the yoke of serfdom, to make a name for themselves as a skilled artisan or a wealthy merchant. It was a faint hope, but it was often all they had to cling to in a world that was indifferent to their suffering. And so they toiled on, day after day, season after season, their lives a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. As difficult as the peasant farmer's life was, there were others in medieval society who suffered even greater hardships and indignities. The life of a serf, the lowest rung on the feudal ladder, was one of unrelenting servitude and oppression. Serfs were bound to the land, unable to leave the manor without their lord's permission. They were required to work a certain number of days each week on the lord's fields, often alongside their own small plots. This labor was unpaid, a form of rent for the right to live and farm on the lord's estate. But the obligations of a serf went far beyond just labor. They were subject to a dizzying array of taxes and fees, levied on everything from the grain they harvested to the animals they slaughtered. If a serf died without an heir, their possessions would revert back to the lord. If a serf committed a crime, they could face punishments as severe as execution. The life of a serf was one of constant fear and powerlessness. They had no rights, no recourse against the whims and cruelties of their lord. They could be bought and sold like livestock, their families torn apart at the lord's discretion. Even their personal lives were subject to the lord's control. A serf could not marry without permission, and the lord could decide who they would marry. Any children born to a serf couple automatically became serfs themselves, destined to a life of servitude. It was a bleak existence, one that offered little hope of escape or betterment. Some serfs tried to run away, seeking a better life in the towns or cities. But if caught, the punishments were severe. A returned serf could expect a brutal flogging at the very least. Repeat offenders might have their feet cut off or be hanged as an example to others. Despite the risks, the desire for freedom was a powerful one. There are records of serfs staging small-scale rebellions, refusing to work or pay their taxes, But these uprisings were quickly and brutally put down by the Lord and his knights. The story of one such serf rebellion has survived in the historical record, a testament to the desperation and bravery of those who dared to defy their lord. It took place in a small English village, not unlike countless others across the medieval landscape. The serfs of this village had long chafed under the tyrannical rule of their lord, a cruel and capricious man known for his harsh punishments and insatiable greed. He raised their taxes constantly, leaving them with barely enough to feed their families. He took the best of their crops and livestock for himself, leaving them with the dregs. One day, after a particularly bad harvest, the Lord demanded even more from his serfs, ordering them to work his fields from dawn to dusk with no rest or food. It was the final straw for the long-suffering villagers. Led by a young man named John, a group of serfs decided to take a stand. They refused to go to the fields, instead gathering in the village square and calling for an end to their mistreatment. Word of their defiance spread quickly, and soon serfs from neighboring manors had joined them, their ranks swelling to over 100 strong. The Lord, enraged by this unprecedented show of rebellion, called for his knights to quell the uprising. The armored men rode into the village, their swords and lances at the ready, but the serfs, armed with only their farm tools and their determination, refused to back down. A fierce battle ensued, the serfs fighting with a desperate courage born of years of oppression. Some fell to the knights' blades, their blood staining the muddy ground. But others managed to unhorse their attackers, turning the tide of the fight. In the end, the serfs emerged victorious, the Lord and his men retreating in disarray. It was a stunning triumph, a moment of hope and possibility in a world that offered little of either. But the victory was short-lived. Word of the uprising spread, and soon other lords were sending their own knights to restore order. The rebels were captured and brought before a hastily convened court, where they were sentenced to death for their treason. John, the young leader of the rebellion, was singled out for special punishment. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts displayed as a warning to other would-be rebels. The other serfs met similarly grisly fates, their brief moment of freedom snuffed out in a blaze of aristocratic vengeance. The village was left broken and cowed, a testament to the ruthless power of the feudal system. But the story of John and his fellow rebels lived on, whispered around hearths and passed down through generations. It became a symbol of the yearning for freedom that lived in the hearts of even the lowliest serf, a flicker of light in the darkness of medieval oppression. The feudal system that bound serfs to the land and to their lords was a complex web of obligations and customs that had evolved over centuries. At its core was the manor, the self-sufficient agricultural estate that formed the backbone of the medieval economy. The manor was ruled by a lord who held the land by grant from the king in exchange for military service. The lord lived in the manor house, a fortified stone structure that dominated the landscape and served as a symbol of his power and authority. Surrounding the manor house were the fields, pastures, and woodlands that supported the estate. These were worked by the serfs, who were bound to the land and obliged to provide labor and a share of their crops to the lord. The serfs lived in small cottages clustered around the manor house, their lives regulated by the rhythms of the agricultural year. They were divided into several classes, each with its own set of obligations and privileges. At the bottom were the villeins, who were essentially slaves, bound to the land and the lord for life. They had no rights and could be bought and sold like property. Above them were the boarders and cotters, who had slightly more freedom, but were still tied to the manor and subject to the lord's will. Higher still were the freemen, who held their land by rent rather than labor and had more legal rights. But even they were not entirely free, still owing allegiance and service to their lord. The manor was a self-contained world with its own church, mill, blacksmith, and other tradesmen. The lord presided over it all, dispensing justice in the manor court and collecting rents and taxes from his tenants. It was a system that had endured for centuries, providing a measure of stability and security in a world rife with chaos and violence. But it was also a system that bred inequality and exploitation, with the vast majority of the population living in a state of perpetual servitude. For the serfs, life on the manor was a constant struggle for survival. They were at the mercy of the weather, the harvest, and the whims of their lord. A bad year could mean starvation and ruin, while a good one might bring a brief respite from the grinding poverty. Their daily lives were governed by a complex set of rules and customs that varied from manor to manor. In some places, serfs were required to grind their grain at the lord's mill and bake their bread in his ovens, paying a fee for the privilege. In others, they were forbidden from cutting wood in the lord's forests or fishing in his streams. Failure to follow these rules could result in harsh punishments, from fines to floggings to imprisonment in the manor's dungeon. The lord had the power of life and death over his serfs, and he wielded it with often ruthless efficiency. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy and community on the manor. The church provided a centre of social life, with mass, saints' days, and other festivals offering a break from the daily grind. Weddings and christenings were occasions for feasting and celebration, even if the fare was meagre by modern standards. But always, the spectre of the Lord loomed over the proceedings, a reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that governed every aspect of manor life. The Lord and his family occupied a world far removed from the serfs, with their fine clothes, rich foods, and leisurely pursuits. For a serf, even a glimpse of this world was a reminder of their place in the order of things. They might catch a sight of the Lord's hunting party, riding out with their hounds and falcons, or hear the sounds of a feast emanating from the manor house. But they knew that such pleasures were not for the likes of them. The story of one such feast has come down to us through the centuries, a tale of opulence and excess that stands in stark contrast to the lives of the serfs who made it possible. It was the wedding feast of the Lord's eldest son, a lavish affair that lasted for 3 days and nights. No expense was spared in the preparations, with the finest foods and wines procured from across the land. The manor's kitchen was a hive of activity, with cooks and scullions working round the clock to prepare the feast. Whole oxen and pigs were roasted on spits, while smaller game birds were baked into pies and pastries. Fish from the estate's ponds were fried and served with rich sauces, while wheels of cheese and loaves of bread were piled high on platters. For the serfs, the feast was a source of both wonder and resentment. They marveled at the abundance of food and drink, so far removed from their own meager rations. But they also seethed at the injustice of it all, knowing that their own hard work had made such extravagance possible. As the feast wore on, the sounds of music and laughter drifted out from the manor house, mingling with the clatter of plates and the clinking of goblets. The lords and ladies danced and revelled, their finery glittering in the candlelight. Meanwhile, the serfs huddled in their cottages, their bellies empty and their hearts heavy. Some muttered darkly about the unfairness of it all, while others simply sighed and went about their work, knowing that there was nothing to be done. In the end, the wedding feast was a symbol of the vast gulf that separated the lords from the serfs, a reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that governed every aspect of medieval life. It was a world of stark contrasts, where the privilege and plenty of the few was built on the backs of the many. But even in the face of such inequality, the serfs found ways to resist and assert their humanity. They told stories and sang songs that mocked the pretensions of their lords, finding humor and solace in shared hardship. They formed tight-knit communities and looked out for one another, knowing that in a world so hostile to their existence, they had only each other to rely on. And in rare moments of defiance, they pushed back against the system that oppressed them. There were whispers of secret meetings in the woods, where serfs gathered to plot rebellion and dream of a better life. Some even dared to flee the manor, risking everything for a chance at freedom. Most of these acts of resistance were small and fleeting, quickly crushed by the weight of feudal power. But they served as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could not be completely extinguished. For the serf, life on the manor was a constant struggle, a battle against the elements, the Lord, and the very system that held them in bondage. But it was also a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, to the ability to find moments of joy and solidarity in even the bleakest of circumstances. As we look back on the feudal world of the Middle Ages, it is easy to see only the oppression and the suffering. But we must also remember the quiet acts of resistance and the enduring spirit of those who lived and died under its yoke. Their stories may be lost to time, but their legacy endures in the very fabric of our modern world. A world built on the struggles and sacrifices of countless generations who came before. And in remembering them, we honor the unsung heroes of history, the serfs and peasants who bore the weight of feudalism on their backs and in their hearts. The Middle Ages were a time of great upheaval and change, as the old world of feudalism began to give way to the rise of towns and trade. For the serfs on the manor, these changes brought both new opportunities and new challenges. As trade routes expanded and cities grew, there was an increased demand for the goods and products of the countryside. Some lords began to see the value in allowing their serfs more freedom to produce and sell their wares, realizing that it could increase their own wealth and power. At the same time, the growth. As the years wore on, the blacksmith's business struggled. The once prosperous town was now a mere shadow of its former self, the streets empty and the market stalls bare. The plague had taken a heavy toll, not just in lives lost, but in the very fabric of society. With so many gone, there were fewer customers to buy his wares, fewer apprentices to train, and fewer hands to help with the work. He would often sit by the forge late into the night, staring into the flickering flames, lost in memories of happier times. The laughter of his children, the gentle touch of his wife's hand, the bustling energy of the town square on market day. Now all was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the echoing ring of his hammer. But still, he persevered. He took on what work he could, repairing farm tools and shoeing the occasional horse. He traded his skills for food and supplies, bartering with what few neighbors remained, and slowly, painfully, life went on. Yet even as the town began to recover, new challenges emerged. The ongoing war between England and France had reached a fever pitch, and the demand for weapons and armor was high. The blacksmith was conscripted by his lord to toil away in the castle forge, churning out swords and shields for the army. He worked long hours in the sweltering heat, his hands blistered and his back aching. The quality of the metal was poor, the charcoal in short supply, but he had no choice but to obey, lest he face punishment or exile. As he labored, he thought of the young men who would wield these weapons, marching off to a war they barely understood. Peasant boys, most of them, just like the blacksmith's own son. Ill-equipped and untrained, they would be fodder for the enemy's arrows and blades. The blacksmith had seen it before, during the previous campaign. His son, barely old enough to grow a beard, had been called up to fight for the Lord's cause. He had marched off with a rusty sword and a patched gambeson, his eyes wide with fear and excitement. For weeks, the blacksmith had waited for news, his heart heavy with dread. And then, one rainy morning, a bedraggled messenger had arrived at the forge with a small bundle of blood-stained rags. His son's meager possessions, all that remained of his short life. The blacksmith had wept then, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He cursed the lords and their petty squabbles, cursed the war and the waste of it all. But most of all, he cursed himself for not being able to protect his own flesh and blood. Now, as he hammered out another blade, he wondered how many more fathers would feel that same anguish. How many more sons would be lost to the meat grinder of war? It seemed a never-ending cycle, a cruel joke played by the fates. But what could a lowly blacksmith do? He was bound by the feudal system, a serf tied to the land and the whims of his lord. He had no say in the decisions of kings and nobles, no power to change the course of history. All he could do was keep his head down, his hands busy, and pray that somehow, someday, things would be different. As the sun began to set outside the castle walls, the blacksmith wiped the sweat and soot from his brow. He gathered up the finished swords, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship, despite the inferior materials. He would present them to the armorer in the morning, another job well done. But as he trudged back to his empty cottage, his thoughts were heavy with grief and resignation. This was his lot in life, to toil and suffer like countless generations before him, to watch his loved ones succumb to disease, starvation, and violence, to endure the back-breaking labor and the oppressive rule of the manor. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there was still a flicker of hope, a stubborn resilience that refused to be extinguished, a determination to carry on despite the odds. It was the same spirit that had driven his ancestors to clear the forests, to plant the fields, to build the villages that dotted the landscape. It was the spirit of the peasant, the serf, the common man, the one who kept the gears of society turning, even as the lords and ladies danced and feasted above. The one who found joy in the simple things, a hearty meal, a warm fire, the love of family and friends. As the blacksmith lay down on his straw mattress, his body aching with fatigue, he clung to that spirit like a lifeline. He whispered a prayer for his son, for his wife, for all the souls lost to the unforgiving maw of history. And he vowed to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep living no matter what trials lay ahead. For that was the only choice he had. In a world of chaos and uncertainty, of disease and death, and endless drudgery, the only thing that remained constant was the indomitable will of the human spirit. And as long as that flame burned bright, there was still hope for a better tomorrow. The blacksmith closed his eyes and let the exhaustion overtake him. As he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of a world where his children could grow up safe and healthy, where the land was bountiful and the people were free. A world where the clang of swords was replaced by the ringing of church bells, where laughter and song echoed through the streets. It was a beautiful dream, a fleeting glimpse of what could be. And though the blacksmith knew it was just that, a dream, he clung to it with all his might. For in that moment, in the quiet stillness of the night, anything seemed possible. And so he slept, his breath slow and steady, his heart filled with a fragile and desperate hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new sorrows, new burdens to bear. But for now, in the embrace of slumber, he could find a moment's peace. Such was the lot of the medieval peasant, the forgotten hero of history, the one who endured, who persevered, who kept the flame of humanity burning through the darkest of times. Their stories may be lost to the ages, their names consigned to the footnotes of dusty tomes, but their legacy lives on, in the very soil beneath our feet, in the blood that courses through our veins. We are the sons and daughters of serfs, the heirs to 1,000 generations of struggle and sacrifice. And though our lives may be easier, our burdens lighter, we must never forget the debt we owe to those who came before, the ones who built the foundations of our world, brick by back-breaking brick. So let us remember them, these unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. Let us honor their memory, not with grand monuments or gilded tombs, but with the simple act of living, of cherishing the gifts they gave us, of striving to build a better world for those who will come after. For in the end, that is the only monument that matters, the one that lives on in the hearts and minds of those who follow, the one that echoes through the ages like a clarion call. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still light. That even in the face of unimaginable hardship, the human spirit endures. And so, as we drift off to sleep in our soft beds and climate-controlled rooms, let us spare a thought for the blacksmith and his kin, for the millions of nameless, faceless peasants who toiled and suffered and died, all so that we might live. Let us remember them, and in doing so, remember ourselves, for we are all a part of the great tapestry of history, woven together by the threads of time and circumstance. And though our individual stitches may seem small and insignificant, together they form a pattern of breathtaking beauty and complexity, a pattern that stretches back to the dawn of civilization and forward to the very edge of tomorrow. So sleep well, dear listener. Sleep and dream of a world where the peasant's plight is but a distant memory, a world where all people, regardless of birth or station, can live with dignity and hope. It may seem an impossible dream, a fool's errand in a world still rife with inequality and injustice. But as the blacksmith knew, even the most impossible of dreams can come true if we only have the courage to believe, to fight, to strive, to persevere against all odds. That is the lesson of the Middle Ages, the lesson of human history itself, and it is a lesson we would do well to remember. So sleep well, my friend. Sleep well and dream big, for in the end, we all share the same dreams, for life, for love, for a better tomorrow. And though the road ahead may be long and hard, we walk it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, step by step, into the bright promise of the future. A future built on the strength and sacrifice of those who came before, those countless souls who struggled and strived to make the dream of a better world a reality. And in those dark and difficult times, they had faith. Faith in themselves, faith in each other, faith in the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle. It is a faith that has sustained us through the centuries, a faith that burns as brightly now as it did all those years ago. So let us keep that faith alive, even as we remember those who came before. Let us honor their memory by living lives of purpose and meaning, by striving to make the world a little bit better than we found it. It is the least we can do, the only fitting tribute to the forgotten heroes of history. And as we drift off to sleep, safe and warm and comfortable, let us offer up a silent prayer of thanks. Thanks for the blessings we enjoy. Thanks for the sacrifices of the past. Thanks for the hope of a brighter tomorrow. For we are the dreams of our ancestors, the culmination of their struggles and their triumphs. And though they may be lost to history, they live on in us, in the very fabric of our being. So sleep well, dear listener. Sleep and dream and remember. For in the end, that is all any of us can do. To remember, to dream, and to carry on the eternal fight for a better world. A world where the peasant's plight is but a distant memory, and the light of hope shines bright for all to see. The cycles of poverty, disease, and oppression continued year after year for the common folk of medieval Europe. Despite their constant toil and hardship, there were still moments of joy and celebration that punctuated their difficult lives. A wedding was always a happy occasion in the village. The bride and groom, though young and facing an uncertain future, beamed with hopeful smiles as they stood before the priest. Their families had scrimped and saved to afford a meagre feast, a bit of pork, some precious white bread, and even a flagon of weak wine. The fiddler played a lively tune, and the villagers danced and laughed, forgetting their troubles for a few merry hours. The birth of a child was another cause for celebration, though tempered by the harsh reality of life. Many infants would not survive their first year, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or the elements. But for now, the new parents marveled at their tiny creation, counting fingers and toes and praying for a strong, healthy babe. Grandmothers and aunts clucked and fussed, imparting their wisdom on swaddling and nursing. A new life, so fragile and precious, kindled a spark of hope in the family. The turning of the seasons also marked the passage of time and brought the occasional festivity. Harvest time, if the yields were good, was a period of relief and revelry. The grueling work of reaping the fields from sunup to sundown was rewarded with overflowing bushels of grain. The lord of the manor would claim his portion, but there was still enough to fill hungry bellies and store away for the lean winter months ahead. The villagers gathered for a harvest feast, sharing the fruits of their labours in a spirit of camaraderie. Platters of roasted meats, pottages thick with vegetables, and fresh-baked bread weighted down the rough-hewn tables. Ale flowed freely, the master vintner having been given extra rations to produce a special batch for the occasion. Music and boisterous laughter rang out into the night as the people made merry, casting off the shackles of their oppression for one joyful evening. Holidays, both religious and secular, were another welcome respite from the drudgery of daily life. Christmas brought feasting and caroling, Easter marked the arrival of spring, and May Day celebrated the return of warmer weather, with dancing around the maypole. Though the aristocracy marked these occasions with lavish banquets and pageantry, the common folk had their own humble traditions. At Christmas, serf families would gather in their one-room hovels, huddled close around the hearth for warmth. The Yule log crackled merrily and cast a gentle glow on their faces as they traded small handmade gifts, a child's doll crafted from corn husks, a new woolen cloak stitched by mother. They sang the old carols and shared stories of Christmases past, finding comfort in the familiar rituals. On May Day morning, the young maidens of the village would slip out at dawn to bathe in the dew, believing it would bring health and beauty for the coming year. They gathered wildflowers to weave into garlands for their hair and danced around the maypole, the brightly coloured ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The young men would cast admiring glances at the pretty girls, and new courtships began to blossom along with the spring buds. But as joyful as these celebrations were, they were but brief interludes in lives filled with constant struggle. For most peasants, each day was much like the last, rising with the sun to tend the fields, toiling under the watchful eye of the manor lord's reeve, falling into bed bone-tired as the last light faded from the sky. It was a hard, precarious existence, with little hope of change or betterment. And yet, there were stirrings of discontent, small sparks of rebellion kindling among the downtrodden. In 1358, French peasants revolted against the heavy taxes and oppressive conditions in the Jacquerie uprising, burning noble estates and demanding reforms. Though the revolt was harshly suppressed, it planted the seeds of resistance. In England in 1381, the peasants' revolt saw tens of thousands of commoners, led by the rabble-rousing Wat Tyler, march on London to protest the heavy tax burden and lack of rights. They stormed the Tower of London, ransacked the Archbishop's quarters, and presented their demands to the 14-year-old King Richard II. Tyler was killed in a scuffle with the Lord Mayor, and the young king deftly dispersed the rebels with false promises. But the uprising sent shockwaves through the nation and cracked the facade of noble invincibility. Gradually, incrementally, the old feudal system began to crumble. The Black Death had decimated the population, making labour more valuable. Peasants could demand higher wages and more rights. The growth of towns and trade gave rise to a new middle class of artisans and merchants who chafed at the rigid social hierarchy. The printing press would spread new ideas and learning to the masses. But these changes came slowly, over generations. Our blacksmith, who had lost his family to the plague, would not live to see his children rise above their station. The farmer's son, returning haunted from war, could not know that his descendants would one day own their own plot of land. The wealthy lord and lady, ensconced in their keep, could not foresee a time when their privileges would be stripped away. For now, life went on as it always had. The sun rose and set, the seasons turned, and the peasants worked and endured. They found joy where they could, in a warm loaf of bread, a healthy child, a village dance. They leaned on their faith to give meaning to their suffering and promise a better life in the world to come. And they clung fiercely to hope, that tiny, irrepressible spark that not even the hardest trials could extinguish. As you drift off to sleep, cozy in your modern bed, take a moment to reflect on the hardships and small joys of those who came before. Their strength, resilience, and unbreakable spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. The slow march of progress, hard fought and still unfinished. And the shared human experience that binds us across the centuries. The love, loss, struggle and triumph that define our mortal condition. Let their stories settle into your dreams, a reminder of how far we've come and how much farther we have yet to go. Rest now and sleep soundly, knowing that you are part of an ongoing human story, rich in complexity and meaning. Good night. The blacksmith's loss was just one small part of the greater tragedy unfolding across the continent. As the plague ramped up its gruesome harvest, fear and desperation gripped the hearts of rich and poor alike. The manor lord barricaded himself and his family inside their stone keep, leaving the serfs to fend for themselves. He ordered his men-at-arms to shoot any peasant who dared approach the gates seeking aid. The once bustling manor courtyards now stood eerily silent, save for the anguished wails of the dying and the creaking of the death carts. The plague spared no one, from the lowliest field hand to the lord's own daughter, a dainty maid of 16 who succumbed to the fever within days. As the Black Death raged on, fields lay fallow and overgrown with weeds. With so many serfs struck down, there were none left to till the soil or bring in the harvest. The Lord watched helplessly from his tower as his wealth and power crumbled along with the bodies of his serfs. What good was his title and estate now, with no one to work the land or pay rents and tithes? The plague left his coffers drained and his larders bare, but even the Lord's plight paled in comparison to the suffering of the common folk. For those who avoided the contagion's icy grip, a slower demise awaited as famine began to stalk the land. With the fields untended and grain stores depleted, the spectre of starvation now replaced disease as the peasant's chief tormentor. Bellies swollen and skin drawn tight over bones, they scoured the barren landscape for any scrap of sustenance. Leather shoes were boiled into a foul gruel, grass and bark mixed with precious handfuls of flour to make bitter bread. Alas, these desperate measures only delayed the inevitable for most. A mercifully quick death from plague gave way to the slow, wasting agony of hunger. Many took their own lives rather than endure the gnawing ache in their gut and the sight of their children's sunken, lifeless eyes. But even in these darkest of times, there were those who clung to hope, however meagre. Throughout this calamity, the local parish priest remained steadfast in his ministry, risking contagion to offer last rites and comfort to the dying. When the plague claimed the blacksmith's beloved wife and children, it was the priest who dug their graves and whispered the prayers that would guide them to eternal rest. And when the blacksmith fell to his knees in anguish, cursing the cruelty of the God who would inflict such suffering, it was the priest who gently consoled him. With a hand on the blacksmith's shaking shoulder, the clergyman spoke of the mysteries of the Lord's will and the promise of reuniting with lost loved ones in the world to come. It was cold comfort to the blacksmith's broken heart, but in time, the priest's compassion and tireless service would indeed spark something in him. Not joy, but perhaps the flicker of faith and resilience needed to carry on in spite of all the suffering and loss. Day by day, the blacksmith emerged from his forge to help the priest tend to the sick and bury the dead. Side by side, the two men fought to keep the embers of hope alive, even as the plague did its worst. Months blurred into years, And gradually, the Black Death began to loosen its grip. The sick were fewer. The death carts no longer rolled through town. Slowly, tentatively, life resumed its normal rhythms. For the blacksmith and the other survivors, the world was forever altered, the wounds of loss still raw and gaping. But they had endured the unimaginable and now looked to the future with the hard-won wisdom of those who have stared death in the face. Just as the people began to glimpse a return to some semblance of normalcy, a new trial emerged on the horizon. Word spread of mounting tensions between the kings of England and France. The peace that had reigned for generations was shattered as ancient rivalries, feudal obligations, and dynastic squabbles exploded into open warfare. The 100 Years' War had begun. For the battle-weary peasants, the eruption of hostilities between crown and nobility was a distant concern, far removed from the immediacy of their hand-to-mouth existence. After all, what did it matter which high-born lord sat upon a gilded throne when you spent your days coaxing stubborn oats from the rocky soil? But the war would not remain distant for long. Soon enough, the feudal levy would come calling, and every able-bodied man would be compelled to fight and die for their lord's ambitions. On a crisp autumn morning, the blacksmith was at his forge, hammering out a new plowshare for the neighboring farmer. His calloused hands gripped the tongs as he plunged the glowing iron into the water barrel, sending up a hissing cloud of steam. Focused on his craft, he almost didn't hear the commotion outside, the jangle of harnesses, the snorting of war horses, the murmur of a gathering crowd. Setting down his tools, the smith emerged from the dingy forge, shielding his eyes against the sudden brightness. There, at the edge of town, a sight that made his stomach clench with dread. A column of armoured knights on horseback, their surcoats emblazoned with the manor lord's crest. Behind them, a contingent of foot soldiers armed with pikes and crossbows. They were here for the levy, to gather up the young men of the village and march them off to fight for lord and land. The blacksmith scanned the ashen faces of the gathered peasants, at last settling on a gangly youth near the front of the crowd. His apprentice, the boy who had come to him orphaned and starving 5 years ago, whom he had fed and clothed and trained in the secrets of metalcraft. With a pang, the smith recalled his own son, dead so long now from plague, and how he had hoped to one day pass on the forge to his own flesh and blood. In the apprentice, he had found a surrogate son of sorts, a way to keep the trade alive, to find meaning and purpose in the wake of losing his family. And now, the war would claim the boy, too. One more loss in a life that had already known too much of it. The blacksmith met his apprentice's frightened gaze, seeing the boy's yearning to run, to hide from the knight's steely summons. But they both understood the futility of defiance or flight. With a heavy heart, the blacksmith stepped forward and drew the trembling youth into a swift, hard embrace. "Be brave," he whispered fiercely as he released the boy to join the conscripts assembling before their manor's knights. "Mind your training. Keep your wits about you." He pressed a small amulet of the Blessed Virgin into the boy's palm, one final token against the unfathomable perils to come. "I will pray for your safe return." The youth nodded mutely, fingers curling around the amulet as he straightened his narrow shoulders and moved to take his place among the ranks of doomed young men. The blacksmith stood helpless, fists clenched as he watched the knights herd their charges away, leading them down the muddy track that would take them to whatever distant battlefield awaited. As the clatter of hooves and rasp of feet faded, the smith turned back to his forge, suddenly cold despite the still smouldering coals in the hearth. In the ringing silence left behind, the emptiness of the years ahead seemed to yawn before him. No children to raise, no legacy to nurture, no one to work alongside as he battled age and arthritis at the anvil. For a moment, grief and futility rose up to choke him, But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he shook off the despair that threatened to claim him. He was no stranger to hardship and loss. None of them were, not after the plague and the lean times that followed. Surrender was a luxury he could ill afford. There was work to be done, always more work. He was needed, perhaps more now than ever. With a new sense of purpose, the blacksmith kindled the flames to a steady roar and took up his hammer once more. If he could not fight for king and country, then he would serve in his own way, by forging the tools and implements that would help his neighbors coax life from the yielding earth, that would rebuild some semblance of the world they had lost. One horseshoe, one hoe, one harrow at a time. He would do his part to knit this fractured land back together. It was a small role perhaps, but a vital one nonetheless. As the war ground on year after bloody year, the blacksmith scarcely allowed himself to think of his apprentice, of the horrors the boy must be witnessing on some distant battlefield. News from the front was sporadic and seldom heartening. Devastating English victories, the shaming surrender of the French king, the scourge of marauding free companies that ransacked the land in the wake of the army's passing. The smith could only pray that the boy's skills, honed under his own exacting tutelage, would be enough to keep him alive, to mend the armor and arms of his comrades, to shoe the destriers and coursers of his knight-masters. And on the rare occasion that he allowed himself to imagine the boy's return, he pictured the apprentice stepping up to the anvil, no longer a callow youth, but a man tested by the crucible of war, ready to take his rightful place as master of the forge. But such thoughts were a dangerous indulgence, a distraction from the ceaseless toil of the present. And so the blacksmith poured himself into his labors, hammer ringing from dawn to dusk as he crafted the humble tools of sustenance and survival. The seasons turned, peace ebbed and flowed, and still the smith endured, his once strong back bent from years hunched over the anvil, his gnarled hands speckled with burns and scars. Until one evening, as he banked the coals and prepared to shutter the forge for the night, a shadow fell across the doorway. The smith turned, heart catching in his throat as he beheld the figure silhouetted there, taller and broader than he remembered, clad in a stained gambeson and rusted mail, but unmistakable nonetheless. It was the apprentice, or rather the young man he had become, standing on the threshold, his eyes haunted and searching in the forge's dying light. For a long moment, the two simply stared at each other, tears glinting in the smith's rheumy eyes, a tentative smile tugging at the soldier's chapped lips. Then, in a sudden rush, the young man crossed the earthen floor in 2 great strides and fell into his master's embrace, the years and miles and untold sorrows melting away in the comforting safety of the old man's arms. There would be time later for the telling of tales, for the reckoning of all that had passed. The smith knew that the scars his apprentice carried were more than skin deep, that the road ahead would be far from smooth. But for now, it was enough to know that he had come back, that despite the war and the world's cruelties, this one small thread of hope had not been cut. That night, as the forge fires cooled to embers and the 2 men sat to a humble supper of brown bread and bitter ale, the blacksmith found himself marveling at the quiet resilience of the human spirit. They had all endured so much in this hard land, this unforgiving age, the ravages of plague, the deprivations of famine, the brutality of war and oppression. And yet, through some unfathomable alchemy of hope and tenacity, life went on. In the face of the apprentice he had thought lost forever. In the shelter of the forge that had been his anchor through so many storms, the smith felt a flicker of something suspiciously akin to optimism stirring in his chest. The world was changing, slowly but inexorably. The old certainties of crown and manor were giving way to something new, something that promised a measure of hope to even the lowliest serf. Perhaps, just perhaps, the sacrifices and hardships of generations past would prove the raw material from which a better future might be forged. It was a fragile hope, to be sure, but like the apprentice sleeping now by the hearth, it was one he would nurture and guard, knowing all too well how easily such flames could be snuffed out. As the blacksmith banked the coals one last time and shuffled off to his pallet, he offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the roof above his head, for the food in his belly, for the safe return of his apprentice from the maw of war. In a world where so much was uncertain, where suffering and loss were the only constants, these small mercies were precious beyond reckoning. And so, for this one night at least, he would hold them close, a bulwark against the hardships that surely lay ahead. For life would go on, as it always had and always would, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who toiled and struggled, who loved and grieved and dared to hope in the face of all that this cruel, beautiful world could muster. And in the end, perhaps that was enough, to have lived, to have survived, to have played some small part in the great, unfolding story of human resilience. Let the nobles have their castles and their glories. For the likes of the blacksmith and his apprentice, there was a different kind of triumph to be found in the humblest acts of perseverance. In tending the land and mending what was broken, in passing on one's knowledge to the next generation, they would craft a legacy all their own. One forged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, steadfast labours of a life well lived. And so, as the blacksmith drifted off to a dreamless sleep, he did so with a heart at peace, secure in the knowledge that come what may, he and his kind would endure, as constant and unyielding as the turning of the seasons, as eternal as the iron from which they wrought their purpose and their hope. The road ahead would be hard, as it had always been, but they would meet it with the same stubborn strength that had brought them this far, and in the end, that would be enough. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting a golden glow across the manor's fields, the weary serfs breathe a collective sigh of relief. Another day of back-breaking labour is coming to an end. They gather their primitive tools, scythes, hoes, and rakes, and begin the long walk back to their humble homes. Among them is a boy, barely in his teenage years, his hands already calloused and rough from years of working the land. He dreams of a different life, a life beyond the confines of the manor. He's heard stories of the growing towns, of the opportunities for those with a trade. But for now, he is bound to this land, tied by the invisible chains of the feudal system. As he trudges home, he passes the blacksmith's forge, the heat from the furnace hitting him like a wave. He pauses for a moment, watching the blacksmith work. The man's muscles ripple as he hammers the red-hot metal, shaping it into tools and weapons. The boy feels a pang of envy, what he wouldn't give to have a skill, a trade that could offer him a way out of this life of servitude. But such dreams are futile. He was born a serf, and a serf he will die. His life is not his own. It belongs to the lord of the manor. The boy sighs and continues on his way. At home, his family's already gathered around the meagre dinner, a thin gruel made from barley and vegetables. His younger siblings are crying, their bellies aching with hunger. His mother does her best to comfort them, but there is little she can do. The harvest was poor this year, and the Lord has taken his share, leaving them with barely enough to survive. The boy slumps down, exhausted, and begins to eat. The gruel is bland, almost tasteless, but it's all they have. He thinks of the lavish feasts the Lord and his family enjoy up in the manor house. He's heard stories of roasted meats, exotic spices, and rich desserts. His mouth waters at the thought, but he quickly pushes it away. Such things are not for the likes of him. As the family eats in silence, a sudden commotion outside draws their attention. Shouts and screams echo through the village. The boy's father leaps to his feet and rushes to the door. The boy follows close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, the village is in chaos. People are running, their faces etched with terror. And then he sees it, a cart piled high with bodies. The plague doctor walks alongside it, his beaked mask and dark robes a terrifying sight. The boy's blood runs cold. The Black Death has come to their village. Panic grips the boy's heart as he turns to his father, hoping for reassurance, for some way out of this nightmare. But his father's face is grim, his eyes filled with a resigned hopelessness. They both know there is no escape. The plague is here, and it will take its toll. In the days that follow, the village descends into a living hell. The sick and dying are everywhere, their bodies covered in oozing black buboes. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air. The boy watches helplessly as his friends and neighbors succumb to the disease. He prays fervently, begging God to spare his family, but his prayers go unanswered. First, it takes his younger sister, her tiny body racked with fever and pain. Then his mother, who spends her last days caring for the sick, catching the plague herself. And finally, his father, a man who had always seemed so strong, so invincible, wastes away before his eyes. The boy is left alone, a survivor in a village of ghosts. The fields lay fallow, the livestock dead or dying. The Lord is nowhere to be seen, having fled to his country estate to escape the plague. The boy feels a surge of bitter resentment. They've been left to die, abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. But even in the depths of his grief and despair, the boy knows he must go on. He must honor the memory of his family, of all those who were lost. He will rebuild. He will survive. It's all he can do. As the weeks pass, the plague loosens its grip on the village. The death carts come less frequently. The cries of the mourners grow quieter. The boy emerges from his home, blinking in the sunlight. The world looks different now, harsher, crueler. But he is different too, hardened by loss and suffering, but also stronger, more resilient. He looks out over the empty fields, the abandoned homes. He knows it will take years to recover from this devastation, but he also knows that life goes on. The seasons will change, the crops will grow again, and he will be there, tending the land, just as his father and grandfather did before him. The boy sets out to work, his steps heavy but determined. He is a serf, bound to this land, but he is also a survivor, and in that he finds a kind of freedom. The freedom to endure, to carry on in the face of unimaginable hardship. It's a small victory, but in this harsh world, it's enough. As the boy works, his mind wanders to the future. He knows that life will continue to be difficult. There will be more hardships, more losses. The feudal system that binds him is unlikely to change anytime soon, and yet he can't help but hold on to a glimmer of hope. He thinks of the stories he's heard, of peasant revolts in other parts of the country, of serfs who have risen up against their lords, demanding better treatment, more rights. He knows such talk is dangerous, that it could lead to severe punishment or even death. But still, the idea sparks something within him. Maybe, just maybe, change is possible. Maybe one day, serfs like him will be able to own their own land, to reap the rewards of their labor. Maybe one day, education will not be limited to the wealthy and the clergy, but available to all. Maybe one day the rigid social hierarchy that keeps him at the bottom will crumble. The boy shakes his head, dismissing these thoughts as foolish dreams. He must focus on the present, on surviving each day as it comes. And yet, the dreams linger, a tiny flame of hope in a world of darkness. As the sun begins to set, The boy looks up from his work. He takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air. Despite everything, there is still beauty in this world. The colors of the sunset, the rustle of the wind through the trees, the distant laughter of children playing. He thinks of his family, of the love they shared despite the hardships they faced. He thinks of the moments of joy that punctuated their difficult lives, the celebrations at harvest time, the weddings and births, the quiet moments of contentment around the hearth. These are the things that make life worth living, even in the darkest of times. These are the things that give him the strength to carry on. The boy turns his face to the darkening sky, offering a silent prayer. A prayer for the souls of the departed, for the strength to endure, for a better future, however distant it may seem. Then he gathers his tools and begins the long walk home. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new struggles, but for now, he will rest. And in his dreams, perhaps he will find a glimpse of that better world, that glimmer of hope that keeps him going, day after difficult day. As the boy's figure recedes into the gathering dusk, we are reminded of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Throughout history, people have faced unimaginable adversity, war, disease, oppression, poverty, and yet they have persevered. They have found ways to adapt, to survive, and even to thrive. The story of this young serf is the story of countless individuals throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. It is a testament to the resilience and fortitude that is innate to the human condition. We, in our modern times, face our own challenges, but we can draw inspiration from those who came before us, from their strength in the face of adversity, from their ability to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. As we go about our daily lives, with our modern comforts and conveniences, it's easy to forget the struggles of those who came before us. But their stories are a part of our collective history, a reminder of where we've come from and what we're capable of overcoming. So let us honor their memory, not just of the serfs and peasants of medieval Europe, but of all those throughout history who have endured hardship and suffering. Let us learn from their strength and resilience, and let us strive to create a world where such suffering is lessened, where opportunity and freedom are available to all. And as we lay down to sleep, let us spare a thought for the young serf, toiling in the fields of a manor long ago. Let his story remind us to be grateful for what we have, and to never stop working towards a better, more just world. For in the end, that is the legacy we can all aspire to leave. A world that is a little bit better than the one we found. A world where the dreams of that young serf and the dreams of all who came after him can finally be realized. So rest now, dear listener. Let the cares and troubles of the day fade away, and in your dreams, may you find that better world we all strive for, that glimmer of hope that guides us through even the darkest of times. And so, as the sun sets on another day in this medieval village, the blacksmith finally allows himself a moment of rest. He sits heavily on a worn wooden bench outside his forge, his calloused hands clasped together, his head bowed in exhaustion and grief. The loss of his wife and children to the plague weighs heavily on his heart, a burden he will carry for the rest of his days. Around him, the village settles into its nightly routine. The livestock are brought in from the fields, their lowing and bleating filling the air. Smoke rises from the thatched roofs as the women prepare the evening meal over open hearths. Children chase each other through the muddy streets, their laughter a fleeting moment of joy in an otherwise bleak existence. The blacksmith raises his eyes to the darkening sky, watching as the first stars appear. He thinks back on his life, on the twists of fate that brought him to this moment. Born a serf, he was lucky to be apprenticed to the village blacksmith, to learn a trade that would give him a small measure of freedom and status. But even that came at a cost. Long hours of backbreaking labor, burns and scars from the forge, the constant struggle to make ends meet. And now, The plague has taken even that meager comfort from him. His family, his reason for living, gone in a matter of days. He wonders how he will find the strength to go on, to face the uncertain future that stretches out before him. As if in answer to his thoughts, the village priest appears at his side. The old man lays a gentle hand on the blacksmith's shoulder, his weathered face etched with compassion. "Have faith, my son," he says softly. "The Lord tests us, but he also gives us the strength to endure." The blacksmith nods, drawing in a shaky breath. He knows the priest is right. He has survived this long by sheer force of will, by putting one foot in front of the other, even when all seemed lost. He will honor his family's memory by continuing to live, to work, to hope for a better tomorrow. With a final pat on the shoulder, the priest moves on, making his way through the village to offer comfort and prayers to the other survivors. The blacksmith watches him go, feeling a small flicker of warmth in his chest. He is not alone, he realizes. They are all in this together. The farmers and the craftsmen, the serfs and the freemen, all struggling to make a life in this harsh and unforgiving world. He rises to his feet, his body aching with fatigue. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new sorrows. But for now, he will take solace in the simple things: a warm fire, a full belly, the companionship of his fellow villagers. It's not much, but it's enough. It has to be. As the blacksmith makes his way to his lonely cottage on the outskirts of the village, we zoom out, taking in the scene one last time. The flickering torches, the hunched figures making their way home, the sense of a community bound together by hardship and resilience. It's a scene that has played out countless times over the centuries, a testament to the enduring human spirit. And so, we leave this medieval world behind, our hearts heavy with the knowledge of the suffering and struggle that marked daily life for so many. But we also leave with a sense of awe and respect for those who came before us, for their courage and determination in the face of unimaginable odds. As you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts linger on the blacksmith and his village. Imagine the quiet strength that sustained them through the darkest of times, the flickers of hope and humanity that shone through even the bleakest of circumstances. And know that their legacy lives on in us, in the resilience and compassion that we carry in our own hearts. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval history. I hope it has given you a new appreciation for the comforts and freedoms we often take for granted, and a deeper understanding of the human experience that binds us all together. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our channel for more soothing and educational content to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the quiet strength and enduring spirit of those who came before us. Good night.